Gears and begin our continuation of the book of Acts. We're in the 18th chapter of Acts. We'll get there in just a moment. We are on page 39 of our booklets. Does everybody have a booklet? You need one? Everybody has? Kyle, do you have one? Okay, let's get you one. And let's talk through it. The first 12 chapters of Acts, what do we have primarily?
Peter's third.
Peter among whom?
The Jews.
The Jews. Peter's word, and what area or what city primarily? Jerusalem. Good. All right. And then in 13 through 28, we have primarily Paul's work and the going of the transmission of the gospel to the ends of the world. 13 and 14, the first journey primarily in where? Southern what? Galatia. In the 15th chapter, he was dealing with, they had a problem over circumcision, whether Jewish males had to be circumcised, whether they need to keep the law. That basically, the Gentiles have to become like Jews physically in order to be saved. And then at the end of chapter 15, the second journey began. And then we have almost come to the end of the second journey, going with the third journey. Remember, Paul and Silas begin from Antioch. They come through Lystra, pick up Timothy and Luke. They come over to Philippi, and they've been down to Corinth. And then from Corinth, let me see what's happening. Okay, so I'm trying to get my mind caught up with where we are. From Corinth, we just studied what two letters that he wrote? First and Second Thessalonians, exactly right. So from there, now what happens is Paul leaves with Aquila and Priscilla, and they go to Cenchrea, and then they go over to Ephesus, and we're going to have a brief beginning of the church at Ephesus. And Paul is going to leave and go back to Caesarea, salute the church in Jerusalem, Acts 18:22, and go up to the city of Antioch, from which he will begin the third journey, and then that will come over here, and when we have the events of Acts, the 19th chapter. And then Apollos is coming over to Corinth about this time. All right, let's open our Bibles, and we studied verses 12 through 17, where Paul is brought before Gallio, the proconsul, and Gallio beat Paul half to death. Is that true? Gallio beat Paul half to death. Is that right? No, that's wrong. He in fact, what did he do to the case that the Jews brought against Paul? He dismissed it. That's right. He threw it out. And so, as a result of that, some of the Gentiles, probably the lowlife around there, seeing what was going on, they took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and did what to him? They beat him. And he cared for none of these things. Well, we pick up in 18, and let's read 18 through 23. Sister Eleanor, if you would. 18 through 23.
And Paul, after this, tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. And he came to Ephesus, and left them there. But he himself entered into the synagogue, and reasoned with the Jews. When they desired him to tarry longer time with them, he consented not, but bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again unto you, if God will. And he sailed from Ephesus. And when he had landed at Caesarea, gone up and saluted the church, he went down to Antioch.
All right, so with that, we have the end of what journey? The second journey. All right, so before we glance at any of the questions, in verse 18, having tarried after this, yet many days. Most, you wonder, okay, is that after the 18 months or the year and a half that he was there? Likely so. It seems like the year and a half probably included everything we read from the first verse down through about verse 17 when they had Paul brought before them. And then he stayed a few more days later, likely, and then he took this wonderful couple, Priscilla and Aquila, and having shorn his head in Cenchrea, he had a vow. Cenchrea was the seaport town for Corinth. And then they go across the sea, the Aegean, to Ephesus. And then what's he do there? What does Paul do? He enters into a what? Like his usual practice. A synagogue. He reasons with the Jews. And evidently there was some pretty good success. They asked him to stay a little longer. And he says, I will, but I want to go to I want to go on to Ephesus, actually he wanted to go to Jerusalem, and so he set sail from Ephesus. He lands at Caesarea, which is the seaport there, and there was a harbor in Caesarea. Went and saluted the church, though it doesn't say it, that's likely Jerusalem, and then went down to Antioch, not down on the map, that's south, but down altitudinally, which would be actually north to Antioch. And then we have in 23, the beginning of the third journey, having spent some time there in Antioch, he departed and went through the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order, establishing all the disciples. All right, so that's, again, the beginning of the third. Let's look at some of our questions that we have on page 39. Down here in the middle of the page, after the incident with Gallio, how long did Paul remain in Corinth? A good while, many days, that's right. And I mentioned in the note, it seems to be in addition to the time mentioned in verse 11. It's interesting that unlike other cities Paul visited, at Corinth, the Roman government protected Paul and the disciples from persecution. However, when compared to Thessalonica and Philippi, Corinth was none the better for it. That is, insofar as the kind of morality and all that. When leaving Corinth, Paul took with him what couple? All right, and it implied that they stopped in the seacoast town of Cenchrea, which was the port of Corinth. It's interesting, if you'll keep your finger there and turn over to Romans 16, there is a wonderful, wonderful woman who is identified by Paul in some very glowing terms. And she was at Cenchrea. Whose name is she? Oh, Phoebe. Yeah, just look at what he says about her. 1 and 2. Robin, read that if you would.
I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church which is at Cenchrea, that you receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and that you help her in whatever matter she may have need of you. For she herself has also been a helper of me, and of myself as well.
Yeah, you can't get a higher commendation than that, can you? That she was a servant doesn't mean that she was leading or taking authority over people, but you could count on her for so many things. I've been blessed to know some women like that who have just been, if it hadn't been for them, the cause of Christ would have died in that place. I remember when we were in Waycross, Georgia, I went over on a weekly, twice a week, Sunday afternoons and Thursday nights. I went over to Brunswick, and there was a little church there that primarily was held together by some women. And it stayed together for a long, long time. But if it hadn't been for them, I doubt if the work would have been anything there. But baptized some people. And so you just never discount people like that who are just briefly mentioned, but how they are mentioned speaks reams for them. All right, number 7. What did Paul do at this city? That's at Cenchrea. Number 7. He shaved his head, and why? He had a vow. Yeah, a lot of times people question, well, what was that vow? And why did he have it? What was the vow? It's impossible to tell definitely in the note. The only kind of vow the Mosaic Law specified involving shearing one's hair was a Nazirite vow. And this was done either if the vow were interrupted because of defilement, number 6, or at the end of the vow, number 6. The name Nazirite is drawn from the Hebrew word meaning to vow. Its root meaning indicated that one who took it consecrated himself to God for some specific work. We know some individuals in the Bible who had Nazirite vows. Samson, Samuel, John the Baptist were the only Nazirites for life, and they did not initiate the vows but voluntarily accepted them as dedicated by their parents. Paul could have taken a modified form of that vow, a modified form due to the fact that it seems he sheared his hair at the beginning of the vow rather than the end. The hair was to be shaved off at the temple, burned in the fire of the altar, number 6. One's hair was not to be cut at all during that period, and because one taking it was not to drink any juice of grapes, which would have precluded his taking the Lord's Supper. Such vows were discussed usually lasted a few weeks or months. Second, why would Paul have taken such? Again, the text doesn't say. Some have speculated that it could have been for protection and for the success of his mission. Others, a thank offering for the outcome of Corinth. We just can't know for certain because the Bible doesn't tell us. However, we do know that as a Jew, Paul kept the observance of the ceremonial law for some instances, but refused to impose it on others. H. Leo Bowles mentioned. It's an interesting idea. It mentions that he had a vow and that he shaved his head there. It could have been that it was for some. Well, usually, what does a vow entail? Anybody? A vow would entail you're doing what? You're promising something, right? And in the case with Samuel and Samson and John the Baptist, the three that we know about who were pledged to God really when they were born, and then they voluntarily kept it. There's that special, seemingly the special devotion, and I don't know a whole lot more to say. I've thought about that sometimes people probably have made vows that I didn't even know about. Here's a person who has an opportunity to do something, but he's going to forego some other things that are in and of themselves right in order to accomplish that spiritual goal. And so they make a vow. It may be a private vow they make to God that they're not going to do anything until they finish this thing. Not that other things are wrong, but I think that could be. Lee, you look like you wanted to say something.
I'm just thinking about the idea that he could have made the vow, but anything under the law of Christ that superseded the law of Moses, he continued with, such as partaking
The Lord's Supper. Yeah.
But he continued with that vow. And you have to think, if he started the vow at Cenchrea, then he ended it when he got to
Jerusalem. And then,
that would make sense too, because the Jews, that was always one of the issues that he had with, when he got to Jerusalem, was with the Jews that were there. That's just an idea that actually just came to my mind while you were talking about it. But I don't know if you've read anything.
Well, I've read several things and everybody says you can't know. That's basically because there's just not enough information given, except the fact that he did take a vow. And again, I think Lee is exactly right about that. Whatever he did would not have superseded in the law. It wouldn't have superseded the gospel, and he would have partaken of the Lord's Supper. Well, part of the Nazirite vow was you couldn't eat any portion of grapes, eat them or drink the juice from them, and so that would have been out. And that's why some, Bob and others, take the point take the viewpoint that likely it was a modified valve. But whatever the case, what was that?
It must have lasted a week.
At least a week, yeah, that's right.
There
That's
had to be
right.
purpose behind it.
I'm sorry, what was
There
that?
had to be a purpose behind it.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, we're not told what it is, but there have been enough statements made to Paul by the Lord. I go back, I've used this several times. If you look just a few verses back, in 18:9, the Lord said to Paul in the night by vision, "Be not afraid, but speak and hold not thy peace, for I am with thee. No man shall set on thee to harm thee, for I have much people in this city." And when we read from the letter, the 1 Corinthians letter, Paul had quite a bit of trepidation here in Corinth. And it could very well have been the vow, you know, was surrounding some of that. If you protect me, I'm going to give myself completely until now, and then go try to make it back to Jerusalem for the feast. Perhaps that was it. We just don't know. Okay. Yes, ma'am?
Oh, well, I was just thinking, if he had his hair cut off in Cenchrea, it had to have been a modified vow because he wasn't burning it
At the altar. Exactly. In Jerusalem. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Number 8, down at the bottom. From Cenchrea, they crossed the Aegean, traveled approximately 250 miles, and reached the city of Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. While there, Paul reasoned in what edifice? The synagogue. And did they seem to have a favorable response to what Paul taught? Yes. Yeah, they asked him to stay longer. But Paul felt a need to return to Jerusalem to be there, as well as rehearse what had happened to the church at Antioch. He left Ephesus after a brief visit, determined to return if it were God's will, which it was, as we'll see subsequent history. And he set sail from Ephesus. Eventually he landed at the port city Caesarea. He left Priscilla and Aquila at Ephesus, likely to prepare the people to the best of their ability and to help when he returned. If the feast Paul wanted to attend in Jerusalem was the Passover, there was good reason for his hurry. The seas were closed to navigation until March 10, and in AD 52, Passover fell early in April. That's likely when this was. His brief stay in Ephesus gave him time to visit the synagogue and hold some preparatory discourse with the Jews, F.H. Bruce said. The voyage from Ephesus to Caesarea would have taken roughly a month. After landing at Caesarea, Paul went up likely to Jerusalem, 64 miles southeast, and saluted the what? The church, then went down to Antioch. And keep in mind, guys, that you always think down is south. But down is actually north. He saluted the church and went down to Antioch. It's down because Jerusalem was what? On a mountain, elevated. And so he went downhill, but he was actually going north.
Antioch was just about at sea level.
Yes, was sea level. Yeah, right there on the Cayster River. Exactly. Good point. All right.
Notice when
I'm sorry?
he first says he's leaving, he set sail for Syria.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's where Antioch is.
Yes. He's going to end up over here. But in order to get there, he goes to Ephesus first, leaves what couple? Yes. And then he sails to Caesarea, salutes the church, and then goes back to Antioch. So he's Syria. Regina is exactly right. He said he set sail for Syria, but he had some stops in between. Appreciate you saying that very much. Okay, number 12. Paul ended his second journey where it began in Antioch. The journey covered a distance of approximately 2,500 miles. Took about 3 years, best we could tell. While Paul began the journey with Silas, picked up Timothy in Lystra, Luke, and Troas, record indicates that he returned how? By himself, evidently. How long did Paul remain in Antioch before beginning his third journey? What does the phrase say? Some time. Yeah, having spent some time. So we don't know. Could have been a couple of months, 3 months, 4 months, could have been 3 weeks. We're not told of what changes may have occurred in Antioch while Paul was gone or what he did there. The emphasis of Luke's account is pointed to where Paul desired to return. He told, when he left Aquila and Priscilla there at Ephesus, the people in the synagogue said, why don't you do what? Stay a little longer. And he said, well, I plan to return. So it's almost as if Luke is, okay, Paul did this, now let's get him on back to Ephesus. There's a push for the narrative to get Paul back to Ephesus, and we have a whole chapter 19, that he spends, that Luke records he spent at Ephesus. And the time is not stated here in Acts 19, but later on in the 20th chapter, when he called the Ephesian elders, he said, I was with you for 3 years. And so the better part of 3 years, Paul was there, as we have it recorded, and did a tremendous amount of good. I mentioned then the next to the last line, this is evident as he summarizes Paul's stay in Antioch as well as his journey through Galatia and Phrygia, all of which must have taken several months. And he summarizes that in a single brief sentence in verse 23. All right. All right, let's go through our review questions here. Paul and Silas began from Antioch, traveled through the regions of Syria and Cilicia, strengthening. Then they came to Derbe, then Lystra, where they found a young disciple by the name of Timothy, who joined their company. They continued through Phrygia, Galatia, and while Paul wanted to preach in Asia and Bithynia, the Spirit prohibited such at that time. We know when we read Acts 16 that while he wanted to go there, he had some ready people to preach to in Philippi. Who were they? The jailer and Lydia, her house, yeah. All right, they traveled on to Troas, where Luke joined them, as noted by the pronouns we. While at Troas, Paul received a vision during the night of a man from Macedonia who requested their help. Immediately they sailed across the northern part of the Aegean and came to what city? Philippi. 2 specific individuals and their households were converted. Who's first? Lydia, as well as the jailer. Because of a disturbance, magistrates requested they leave. Luke and Timothy remained there, and Paul and Silas go on. Paul and Silas traveled on to Thessalonica, where Paul preached for how many weeks at least? 3. Until trouble again arose, and brethren helped them escape by night to the city of Berea. Silas traveled with Paul to this city, and it's evident that who also joined them a little later? Timothy. Jews from Thessalonica traveled to Berea, stirred up trouble there, and caused the brethren to escort Paul to Athens. There he preached to philosophers on what? Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, about the unknown God they ignorantly worship. And at some point, who rejoined them? Timothy. And he sent him back to Thessalonica to see about the church. We recently studied that. Next page alone, Paul traveled to Corinth, where he joined what couple? Good, who were tent makers. He continued to preach in the synagogue, but then eventually, what couple rejoined him? Silas and Timothy. And because of the good report Timothy brought concerning the Thessalonians, Paul wrote back to the church that first letter, 1 Thessalonians. Due to some misunderstandings, a second letter was likewise written that we just finished studying a couple classes ago. Paul remained there how long in Corinth? A year and a half. And how many of the Corinthians? Many, hearing, believed, and were baptized. Afterward, Paul and his company traveled towards Syria, Aquila and Priscilla going as far as Ephesus. Paul spoke briefly with the Jews and promised to return. Then he sailed to Caesarea, traveled up to Jerusalem where he saluted the church, and concluded the journey by going down where he had begun at where? At Antioch. Okay, so we're going to, Lord wills, we'll get in, not going to go there. We'll get on into, if you'll notice the next page, Acts 18:23 is really the beginning of the third journey through chapter 21, verse 17. And on page 42, I have kind of an overview of that journey with a map and the significance of where Paul was when he wrote some of these letters. And then on page 44, we'll go on into the problem that developed over Apollos. His problem was he knew about Jesus, he taught accurately, but he knew only what? The baptism of John. So he helped him out on that, and then he ends up going to Corinth. And we've been going through 1 Corinthians recently on some lessons. Remember, Paul says, some say I am of Paul, some of Apollos, some of Cephas, some of Christ. They were divided. So we'll see all that in just a little bit. Comment or question as we enter the second journey? All right, real quick. What two letters were written on the second journey? First and Second Thessalonians. Are those the only letters written that we know about on the second journey? Yes or no? Yes. Yes, that's the only ones we know about. And from where did Paul write them? Corinth. Okay, good.